Hi there, everyone. My name is Jennifer Buwersi, one of the co-directors of Music for Inbox, and today we're going to have another artist chat, this time with the visual artist for the mail art for this month, Sabrina Gschwandtner. So I'm going to get her invited, and then we'll have our conversation.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, excellent. Thanks for joining us today. I was just introducing you, the visual artist for our mail art this month, and we get to share your really beautiful piece. I have it here, Camouflage, to one of your film quilts. But today I was wondering if we could start in our conversation. I was looking through kind of your portfolio, and you have this really incredible long history of kind of textile crafts art and combining that with film. And I was really curious when I was looking at like kind of what draws you to these mediums and like what your history is to them, and like when did they come together, or have they always been really linked for you?
I think the short answer to that question is that I grew up in a familial environment wherein I was just accustomed to thinking of creativity via sort of intersecting modes of expression, and there wasn't, like, my mother was a painter and she also did pottery and sculpture and etched glass artwork. She's not an architect, but she designed the house that my parents live in. She found a builder to make it for her. So I think through her, and then my maternal grandmother was a painter, and my maternal ancestors were quilt makers, and I grew up in Virginia, where I was exposed to really the folk art and crafts of the American South. So I think just these were all my influences, and I didn't ever, and I'm kind of still not so interested in how things are separate, or I think about them in this intersecting way. But the longer answer to that is that I took a summer class at Harvard when I was a high school, the summer before my senior year of high school, and I studied. I wanted to get credit for psychology. And so I was drawn to this class called Film and Psychoanalysis, taught by a professor named Vlada Petric, who was the co-founder of the Harvard Film Archive. And Vlada was writing a book on oniric cinema. Oniric is Greek for dreamlike. And so we would watch movies that were meant to portray or induce altered states of consciousness, ASCs as he called them. And so it was in that class that I learned how to study film editing. Through the lens of thinking about, like, how does the film editing induce a dreamlike state in the viewer. And then I went on to college and I studied semiotics and film, avant-garde film and some experimental video with Leslie Thornton and Tony Coates. And Leslie was really my mentor, and she talks about film as a kind of shared thinking. That's the way that she describes it. And at some point in college, I spent a summer living with my paternal grandmother in Salzburg in Austria, where my dad is from. And I studied with Valley Export, who's this feminist actionism artist. And working with Valley, I learned about the radical potential of direct tactile contact with an audience. So it was really through these influences of Leslie and Valley that I started thinking about film and working with film as a form through which pleasure and critique could be intertwined. Mm-hmm. And that's something that has been important to me to this day. And the last sort of point of connection was that I learned to knit and crochet from my mom when I was around 8, which seems a little bit dissimilar from other people I know who are my age, who it seems like it kind of skipped a generation. Like, a lot of people I know learn to knit like on their own or from their grandparents. But my mom, like, I think my mother's generation, a lot of them rejected it as a form of feminism. But I learned from my mom, but by college I had mostly forgotten. So I lived with 3 RISD students my senior year of college, and 2 of them were textile students, and our apartment was very, very cold. And And so we would hang out in the kitchen, and they kind of retaught me how to knit and crochet. And I just like sort of fell into it. And I was sort of finishing up my film classes, and in the film major at the time at Brown, students had to do a lot of like really dense theory reading. And so I developed this way of like reading and then stopping to knit and reading and stopping to knit. And I just really loved working directly with color and texture. That's so different. I mean, there's elements of that with filmmaking. I was the last generation to learn how to edit on film and simultaneously learn to edit on video. It was sort of as I was finishing that, like, we had access to Final Cut, but we were learning in this older program called Media 100, and you had to like sign up to use the computer with Media 100. It wasn't like as ubiquitous as it is now, but we also had to learn to shoot on film and edit on film. So I simultaneously learned both. And so working with fiber, that not only did the fiber material contain what I considered crucial histories of feminism, it also was the form through which I could conceive of, both physically and intellectually, of how to work with film as a physical material. So that's my long answer.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing the long version, because it's fascinating to see how these like little moments kind of intertwine to land you somewhere. I love it. So like taking from that thread, pun intended, can you tell me like how you came from that to the film quilt project in particular?
Yeah. So in 2009, the archivist at Anthology Film Archives, named Andrew Lampert, hi Andy, either called me or emailed me, and he said, Sabrina, I have some material that you need to check out. And basically, the Fashion Institute of Technology, FIT, had deaccessioned the 16 millimeter films in their collection. And they called Andy and they said, we have this material, we're not using it. What can we do with it? So Andy took it in, and he kept some of the films for Anthology's permanent collection of films. And then he gave the rest to artists and filmmakers who work with found footage. My understanding of that was that people weren't projecting films in classrooms anymore. Some of the material had also shifted in color. Kodak came out with a stock that was like used heavily in the let's say 50s to 70s. That and this is really true of like any film material, actually, if it's not kept in conditions that are stable in temperature and humidity, the color will change. So a lot of the films had shifted from full color to like red, pink, purple. There's the acetate film is prone to something called vinegar syndrome, which is where it emits like a vinegar smell, and it starts to, at that point you don't really want to be like running it through a projector. So physically the material wasn't, some of it wasn't able to be projected, but I also think that, the schools, this was a period where we like made the switch from film like to video, and some of the films were available on video on YouTube. So I also had the feeling when I brought the box of films back to my studio that Andy gave me from Anthology, that it might also be the subject matter of the films wasn't like interesting anymore. The films that I received were dated from the 1950s to the 1980s, and they all, they were all educational documentaries about textiles, but textiles in different formats, like textiles as art, as craft, as vocation, military camouflage, political expression. There was one film called The Enchanted Loom that was actually an experimental science documentary with an original soundtrack by Pink Floyd that used Charles Sherrington's metaphor of the brain as a loom that would wake from a night's sleep, so like weave meaningful patterns. So it was a science film, but it was like using textiles as a metaphor. So when I watched all the films, I felt like primarily in the through line in terms of the meaning of the films had to do with like women making textiles, and I felt really sad that they were being deaccessioned. Also sad for the material, you know, as someone who loves film. So I watched the films and I felt sad, and I also thought about string quilts, which are a form of quilt making wherein makers take long, thin fabric scraps left over from other projects and sew them together into a quilt. The most sort of well-known example of these are ribbon quilts. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, but pretty much mostly women would save these ribbons that went around cigar boxes, and when they had enough ribbons, they would make a quilt out of them. I actually have a piece of 16 millimeter film here. Cool. So here's a piece of 16. So if you see, oh, this is like, here, yeah, you can see.
Great.
Yeah. So like, this is actually film I shot in my old studio in New York of myself crocheting. So film has this, you know, it takes 24 of these still frames, right, to equal a second of motion. And so film has this repeated imagery that to me resembles a textile pattern. So I was already sort of thinking, you know, and I was doing this when I first got the films. I was holding them up and like looking at the material before I like projected them. And I was thinking about it as a textile, but then I was thinking about the content of the film and thinking like, how can I want people to see this material. So thinking about the string quilts, I thought, oh, well, I could make a quilt out of these. And that's how I started. I made my first one in residence at the Museum of Arts and Design in 2009. And then, you know, as I've gone on to make them, one way I think about the film quilts is that they use this notion. Have you heard this term, filmic suture?
No. Oh, I haven't.
It's this term for the use of editing to draw viewers into a story. So it's like this reconfiguring, very literal reconfiguring of the idea of suture, of stitching viewers into the film. And I guess I've been making film quilts in some form or another ever since, because to me, it's like a three-dimensional form of film editing. And I think about the narrative possibilities in film editing and also in this format of a quilt, and how instead of seeing, you know, in a film you would watch one scene followed by another scene followed by another scene. It's like you have these scenes that are, with a quilt, that are next to each other or above and below each other, and then they form these patterns, and that's like a different narrative format. So that's how I start making the quilts.
It's incredible. I want to take a moment then to kind of, I mean, thank you for sharing the 16 millimeter film. Like I've seen some before, so I have some reference, but it's super helpful to like see kind of the scale of it. And it has, I don't know the technical terms for anything, but it has like the little holes in the side too and everything.
Rocket holes.
So I wanted to share the postcard again and kind of give some context too. So this is Camouflage 2, which we're getting to share as a piece of mail art. You made it in 2012, and for scale, the original of this is just over 6 feet by 4 feet. So like very, like an actual quilt, like a full kind of black quilt size. And as you described, this is from the film from the Fashion Institute of Technology, and I also read that there's another film, Shadows Everywhere, of children making shadow puppets in there. And that this pattern is the sunshine and shadow American quilt motif. So I'm going to like move it really close, which is terrible, but just so people can see. And then like on the back, we have a little example so people can see like the detail of something we struggled with. Was we loved the scale of it, but we could understand how the actual real life scale gives you that kind of ability to like dive into the narrative, like you mentioned, where you could kind of see actual like what was happening and the kind of the content of the film as well as the kind of aggregate of the film. We really struggled with, should we just do a close-up? But it's such a gorgeous piece that we figured we'd have our cake and eat it too, that you get a peek on the back and then the full image. So that's the gorgeous piece that you're allowing us to share. We're super grateful. And I was wondering if you could talk about like how you made it, if there's any kind of significance to the patterning,
Mm-hmm.
and how is it sewn too, like
Yeah.
together?
Yeah. Each piece that I make, there is a significance to the pattern. So with
Mm,
this is those are squares that are. You start with a small square and you build around. That's called a log cabin
mm,
square. And if you vary the lights and darks, and in these each square has half a light and half a dark, then you can put them together to create all these different patterns. This is like sort of a chevron shape. And the
mm,
idea with this one, the sunshine and shadow pattern, I could also say is heavily associated with the Amish in America. It's not clear that they invented it, but heavily associated. There's a lot of Amish quilts that use this pattern. And when I was thinking about the theme of the piece is camouflage, and what does camouflage mean? And the footage, one of the films actually features literal camouflage being produced in a textile factory. But I chose this pattern because I was thinking about, I wanted it to sort of look like sun is casting shadows down from the top to the bottom of the piece. Like when you're flying in an airplane and you see like shadows moving across the landscape, like that kind of view. So the piece is constructed, like as you mentioned, from two different films. One was the accession from FIT. The other one I purchased on eBay. I have a few films that I get periodically on eBay that I just sort of add into my collection. So I dismantled the sort of original narratives of both films and reinterpreted them through this like traditional sunshine and shadow pattern. So the dark footage is from this industrial film from FIT, and it's a manufacturing documentary that shows how fabric was made at a company called the Bradford Dyeing Association in Rhode Island. And the lighter footage is an instructional children's film about shadows. So the Bradford Dyeing Association was one of the longest running textile mills in the U.S. And the film doesn't get into that. The film is sort of like, this is how fabric is made, and here it is going off the machine, and that's sort of the gist of the film. It's like, look at how fabric is made and dyed, and that's it. What it doesn't get into is that the Bradford Dyeing Association was the largest supplier of U.S. Of camouflage to the U.S. military for decades. From before the Civil War, I think it closed in 2011, and that it closed because they lost a lot of money. They couldn't, it financially wasn't feasible to run anymore, partially because of fines for environmental dumping, like just dumping chemicals out of the factory, so pollution. They also, there were a lot of labor law abuses there, like they fired everyone and they would only hire them back if they'd promised not to unionize, this kind of thing. So I thought the film was really interesting because all it gets into is like, here's how fabric is made in this very like, seemingly, or like trying to be objective type of way, and not getting into, the labor law abuses, the environmental pollution, or actually even what they were making, which was camouflage for the military. And then the second film is this very sweet film that's just sort of introducing children to the idea of sunlight and shadow, like how are shadows made? And so these kids, the young children, are depicted in the beginning of the movie making shadow puppets in front of a piece of cloth, and then they go outside and they look at how shadows are created by the sun. And so combining these two films, I wanted to represent the idea of camouflage in multiple ways. Like there's the camouflage being made for the military, there's the environmental dumping and pollution and labor law abuses being sort of camouflaged in this like documentary about the mill, and then there's this this idea of how sort of fun, like I have a kid, like how fun hiding can be, like yeah. And I was also just thinking about, having worked with all these documentaries, this idea that whenever oftentimes one can shed light on something and leave something else in shadow. So that's what that piece is about.
So beautiful and so cool. I was, you kind of touched on it, but I wanted to kind of give like a moment to maybe expand on it. Is um, you know, there are a lot of ways that these quilts that you make relate to kind of lost histories and feminism and the kind of complicated histories, like in this film, how there's kind of the veneer presentation of the process, but then these like histories behind it. Can you talk about how you kind of how you see these connections between the quilts and kind of lost stories and feminism and erasure?
Yeah, I think this 16 millimeter, I mean, I would say all of my work, one of the through lines in the work is uh, validating women's histories that have been ignored, overlooked, belittled, whether that's the sort of material culture that women made, or if it's the historical achievements in film that have been overlooked for so long. And, what I have found making this work, and I didn't know this when I first started making film quilts, but there are these historical connections between filmmaking and sewing. So even at the level of the technology, there are these material culture histories that are just sort of glossed over. Like the Lumiere brothers invented one of the first cameras. It was also a projector. And the way that they figured out how to get it to work was by modeling it after the newly popular sewing machine. So if you think about the way that fabric goes through a sewing machine with brief stops during which the needle makes stitches in the fabric, that's what they used. That idea is what they used in this, it was called a cinematograph, in this apparatus where film would go through it with brief stops, intermittent motion, with brief stops during which an image was either recorded or projected. And that was in the late 1800s, 1890s. And about 30 years later, in the early days of Hollywood, women were hired to edit film, to hand color film, because they were thought to have these nimble fingers from doing things like sewing. Mm-hmm. So these are things I didn't learn about in school. It was like only through my own research that I came to understand, oh, there are these, there's so many suppressed histories in the arts. And so with the 16 millimeter work, I was thinking a lot about these undervalued histories that were recorded in the material, and what was also very interesting to me was the films from the 50s had a certain format, which was show the material and have a male, like an omniscient male narrator describing what you're looking at, usually British sounding. But by the 60s, 70s, that format was getting broken up. And one of the latest films I received was called Quilts and Women's Lives by Pat Ferrero from 1981. And in that film, it's a portrait of a handful of quilters from around the U.S., a diverse set of women. They're speaking directly to the camera, and they're talking about their work in their own terms and what it means to them and why they're doing it. And I really wanted to sort of mark in some of my work this shift in format. So that was with the 16 millimeter work, and for the past like 4 or 5 years, I've been making 35 millimeter films. So I'll show you that.
Love it.
So here's 35, which is, let me show you the 16. That's the 16 I worked with for a long time, and that's the 35. So it's about twice the size. So for that body of work, I started thinking about my film education, which was very deep, also privileged. I studied, as I mentioned, for a summer at Harvard with the co-founder of the Harvard Film Archive. Then I went to Brown, and then I have my MFA from Bard in film video in this interdisciplinary program, but concentrating in film video. And then I worked as a curator, as a film curator and programmer, and I am a committed student of the material. And a few years ago, I started thinking about I had to move in so many environments that were male dominated and that were felt, I would say at worst, scary, like physically, like dangerous, and like kind of begrudgingly accepting of a feminist point of view. And I started thinking, like, what was it like for the earliest women? Like, if this is like how it is now, in the wake of Me Too, and it still feels so problematic, like, what was it like for women when film got started? And I think probably the earliest films I studied were from the 30s and 40s. So like Maya Deren was probably the earliest woman whose work I was exposed to as a student. But going back even farther and working as I have started doing and have been doing for the past 8 years in collaboration with, or at the same time as, a number of other people who are excavating the earliest women's work in film, like namely the Women Film Pioneers Project out of Columbia and edited by Sue Friedrich's project, which is published by Princeton. Those are both online projects, but I'm also thinking about the distributor Kino Lorber, which has put out has put out the selection of really early films by women, which you can find online, but also they did a series of screenings around the country of those. So I started making 35 millimeter films using the earliest films made by women. What I discovered, which I was never taught, was that when cinema started, women were making films, and they were making films from their own perspectives. And it wasn't until cinema was industrialized and started making money, like a lot of money. So that would have been when sound entered the picture. Women were basically bumped to behind the scenes work, like editing. And as I mentioned, like hand coloring film before color film was invented. So I've gotten really interested in that erasure and thinking through like how to make, kind of like with the 16 millimeter film, like how to make those narratives more accessible. This body of work has a similar impetus, like how do I make these foundational narratives more accessible to the next generation of filmmakers and artists? Because I think that providing a lineage for makers to learn from is really, really important. And it's something that it makes me sad, all the work I've had to do to find these narratives that I didn't know about. And it makes me sad that, so much of the material was just lost to history. There's a certain amount that I've been able to find. So the way that I access this material is I contact archives. So I did a film with Marion E. Wong's film, who was like the first Asian American filmmaker. She was a Chinese American filmmaker who made a film in 1916. It came out in 1917. She made one movie and couldn't find distribution, and so the film was like no distributor wanted it. They didn't think that white audiences would watch a movie that didn't feature racist, like Asian tropes. So her one film that she made through a production company she started with a script she wrote. She was in the film. It just lingered in the care of her sister until her relatives unearthed it, and now it's in the archives of the Academy of Film Academy of Film Archives here. So I got that footage from them. I've been able to find other films from the British Film Archives, from Gaumont Pathé in France. So largely the work that's been saved has been made by these white European women. And like there's other material like the Ehlers sisters in Mexico made films in the before 1920 that were commissioned by the government and meant to celebrate Mexico. I think those films burned in a fire. I can't find them. Fatma Begum in India made what sounds like incredible films. I haven't been able to find those anywhere, and she pioneered special effects. So there's all this material that just has essentially been erased because it wasn't archived, so it's lost to history. But the films that I have been able to find, I get a video file from an archive. I send the file to my lab, my film lab that I work with. They make a negative and then a print, and then I've been making video work and film quilts from that material. So not only is it about like making this early work by women more well known, it's also about like there's not just a male-centered bias in our history. It's also like Northern American and European biased. And I think it really does have an impact on what young makers think is possible to see a canon that is so narrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it struck me as you were talking that there's a sense of like dedicating time to things that are important, and like, you know, things being forgotten, kind of part of that being like time not being spent with them. We're invested in their futures. And something that really strikes me about the act of like making a quilt of these materials is like the time spent with them, like kind of reclaiming the fact that like these are things that deserve time and attention. And it's really interesting to think about time in your work as like the time you spend making them, and also the fact that they're usually time-based art forms that are kind of in this more frozen way that you can explore them. I don't know, it's very inspiring to kind of like tease out some of these very cool things that are happening in your pieces. And that kind of leads me to one of my last questions, which is that like your pieces, I'm going to hold it up again because I just love it so much. Your pieces are so like visually striking. They really stand on their own as kind of visual works, but they have really cohesive, clear, and impactful ideas about them, behind them, I mean. So when you're making these, do you find that when you go into a piece, you have like something you're trying to say with it, or do you kind of discover what the piece is saying as you've made it, or is there something kind of in between? How do the physical nature, the materials, and the concepts, when do they come together or emerge?
Usually with the 35 millimeter work I've been making, I have to have a really clear idea of what I want to do beforehand because I have to license the footage. So sometimes, you know, usually the way the licensing works is I will license like a minute of something. So in that case, I have to be really judicious about what I'm looking for and what I want to make. The scale of the 35 millimeter work is so much more expensive because I have a licensing fee, and then the printing fee is it's a bigger format. So it's more expensive to produce the material on film. So in those cases, I'll have watched. And in any case, when I go to an archive, I have to say, like, this is the material. This is the specific film by the specific artist I'm looking for. So in that case, I have a really strong idea of what I'm going to do because I've sort of workshopped it pretty heavily before I get to the point of acquiring the material. But with the 16 millimeter work, and in the case of a couple of films where the licensing has been such that they're like, we'll just give you the whole film because it's so short or whatever. Usually I have an idea, but there can be a physical or material-based discovery along the way that like leads me in a new path. Like I've done a number of film quilts with a film called Hearts and Hands, also made by Pat Ferrero. Pat found out that I was working with Quilts in Women's Lives and contacted me and said, hey, I have all these other prints of other films, like, do you want those too? And I was like, yes, of course. And that started us down this like friendship and professional relationship we've had for like a decade now, which has been so lovely. We just did a talk together at Scarball, which was really fun. And I feel like I've drawn from a history that she's created through her filmmaking that's like this alternative history, because she had to do so much research into using, you know, like quilt archives. And it's like when you're trying to recreate history, you have to go to these alternative sources. Like you can't go to like the Library of Congress, you can't go to like all these books that were written about like a certain canon. You have to like search through these other, you know, other places that keep historical records, you know, like local archives or, you know, quilt collections, private quilt collections, etc. So Pat had already done sort of like a lot of legwork, like creating this, you know, creating these films that I could use as the basis for my work. So I'm so grateful to her. But I had, to answer your question, I had worked with Hearts and Hands, a film she made in 1988. I'd made a number of pieces about it, and then she had some film footage of Elizabeth Keckley, of a picture of Elizabeth Keckley in the film. And do you know who Elizabeth Keckley is? Elizabeth Keckley was born enslaved, and she worked as a dressmaker to make money to buy her freedom, and then eventually she worked as a dressmaker to marry Todd Lincoln and became like a friend and close confidant of hers. And there's not a lot of photography of Elizabeth Keckley, but Pat had used a photo of her in Hearts and Hands. So I decided like Camouflage was a piece that I would consider more of like a critique piece, but I've done a couple of pieces from like homages. And so I decided, I should make something with this footage of Elizabeth Keckley. So it's like an homage to Elizabeth Keckley. So that's an example of how, again, long-winded answer to your question, but how I work, where yes, sometimes there's sort of a discovery that happens, and other times I sort of set out with a clear intention of what I want to make.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I think it's so important to hear stories of like where inspiration and concepts come from, because when you see something finished and you like hear it described, it can make it seem like impossible to reach that place. Like, how did someone get that? So it's really, really inspiring and helpful to hear like that it comes from all different angles and processes. So thank you for all of the long-winded bits and purchasing. So I think that's all the questions I have. I wanted to know if there's anything I missed about either the piece. I don't know if we talked about actually like, are they like hand sewn together?
There's a little bit of handwork, but it's mostly done on a Bernina sewing machine that I've had like more than 20 years. Yeah, so I use polyester thread and a sewing machine. And there's some hand stuff that happens here and there at the end, but
yeah, but I don't know why I couldn't conceive of the fact that they were actually sewn at all. Like, until I was reading about it, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So that's so neat. So, and then is there anything else that you want to add about the project, or about anything you have coming up that you're excited about, or we might have covered?
I'm excited about this large scale video work I've been doing. So I'm making like the equivalent of film quilts, but in video. So I use the same material as video, and I edit it into a moving image quilt. I made 3 billboards that were shown on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, which was really cool, because each piece was about a different overlooked woman filmmaker, and the idea of like returning their work to like the most coveted movie advertising space in the country was really exciting, and also to see it at like 20 by 50 feet. And I had written a little bit of information about each of them in my handwriting, and then shot that and included it. So it was really cool to see my handwriting like on a billboard. So my next piece, the piece I'm working on now, is a 150-foot long video for this video wall in Chicago called 150 Media Streams. So I'm working on that now. I'm excited about that. That'll be out in December or January. It'll be out.
So attention, Chicago.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really exciting.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure those video quilts, or if I've said that right, are on, I believe they're on your website or your Instagram, because I did remember seeing those, that it's like an edited, but it's a video that plays with the shaping of a quilt in it. So people can check that out. Because it's quite different in appearance from these, but you can definitely see the lineage or the connection. So, well, I just want to share with people who are watching that if you want to receive Sabrina's mail art, you can grab a ticket. It's on our website, musicforyourbox.com, and we'll hand address these to you and send them out. You should get them right around April. We're in the month of April 20th. So thank you again for letting us share your work on our series and for talking with us. It's so inspiring and beautiful, and we're very, very grateful.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be part of this project.
Well, I will see you around, and until then, everyone enjoy Camouflage too. Bye.